Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Long time no see, but we're back with another episode of the NTC podcast. This is episode 128 here in Washington, here with you guys. Glad to be back hosting an episode of the pod for the new year. We're here in 2025, and we're excited to break down the NBA on a broad level and a very specific level when it comes to everything that's going on in the league. This afternoon, I have a very awesome special guest. It's been a while since we linked up, but we are fellow Miami Heat supporters here. This is Sean Rochester. He does some great work over at Five on the Floor, 5 Reasons Sports, covers the Miami Heat quite a bit. And with everything they have going on, I figured it'd be a good opportunity to bring in Sean and get his opinion, get some of his takes on what's been going on with the Heat, Jimmy Butler specifically. He's been a hot topic, not just in the Heat community, but in the NBA in general. And then also we're going to take a little bit of a look at what Phoenix has going on right now here with Bradley Beal. The two have been linked a little bit. Beal would love to go to the Heat, Jimmy to the Suns. Not sure if that's going to happen, but wanted to also kind of dig into their situations, and since it's also a hot topic, and it's pretty interesting what they have going on there right now over there in Phoenix. So, hey, Sean, I appreciate you jumping on, man. Glad to be able to link up with you again. Love what you do with the Heat community, and just glad to have the opportunity to chat it up with you about the Heat, man. So thanks again.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. It's been a couple of years since we linked up in Summer League in Vegas. I think 2 summers in a row. But glad to be on the pod. I listen to it whenever it comes out on my pod feed. So appreciate you having me on.
Awesome. Glad to hear that, man. So we're going to get right into it here and start off with the Miami Heat and what they have been dealing with here from an encore perspective. So that's where we're going to kind of start our tour here this afternoon. First and foremost, Jimmy Butler, just to kind of get into the meat and potatoes of everything here. Jimmy hasn't quite been the same player as we've seen in years past. Some of that is probably age. He is 35 now. He's getting up there. He's played a lot of seasons in the NBA. But also, aside from that, Sean, it just seemed like at times he just hasn't been super motivated. He hasn't been that fiery Jimmy that we know and love. And then on top of that, I mean, he's missed quite a few games. That's nothing new for him. But when you pair his subpar production with being in another rotation, now being suspended for 7 games, it's a lot for the Heat to handle. Specifically, I'm looking at his points per game. I mean, I know it's a very basic stat, but I mean, he's averaging 17 right now in the games he's played this season. That's his lowest average in a Heat uniform. He's never been below probably 19 points a game. And it's his lowest output since 13-14. That's his 3rd season in the league. The shooting splits are still pretty good. 55 from the field, 37 from 3, just below 80 from the free throw line. But yeah, it's just been a lot of up and down, a lot of drama for him. So I kind of want to start off by asking you, what's been your overall opinion of Jimmy so far this season? And, do you feel like he's doing more harm than good to the Heat at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think the story of this whole saga really has to start in the summertime. Like we know there were events that have happened over the last few weeks, really kicking off on Christmas Day, but over the summertime, when that postseason presser where Pat made his comments, or I guess if you want to go back to when Jimmy made his comments about the series, but really with Pat's comments, he challenged Jimmy. And he challenged other players too. He challenged Tyler Hero. He called him fragile in that press conference. But he challenged Jimmy to go out there and play more games specifically. And as you said, Jimmy has not done that. And you can't fault him for suspension necessarily because that's a choice the Miami Heat made to suspend him. And all indications are that he was legitimately sick before the suspension. But there were times, not just this year, but in previous years, we know that he dealt with the loss of a family member, but also he just chose at times not to show up. And that was the problem that the Miami Heat had to deal with. And they really bent over backwards in a lot of ways. And honestly, historically, in a lot of ways that he didn't do that for Alonzo Mourning, LeBron James, Shaquille O'Neal, Dwayne Wade, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you think about these past few regular seasons as a Heat fan, it is uneasy. Like there are times we know that the Heat have looked like, wow, we are a contender. And there are also times where you're like, how the heck did we just lose to the Detroit Pistons or Charlotte Hornets or, one of those types of teams? And so, I don't go back and fault Pat for the challenge of him. I feel like he did what the Miami Heat needed him to do, is to get Jimmy to come in here motivated, playing in as many games as possible. And so far, he hasn't lived up to that. And I think the harder thing, and to your point about the rest of the roster and the coaching staff, I think it's been hard, and we've talked about this on our post-game shows quite often on 5 Reasons, is that when Jimmy is there and he's not engaged, I think it's hard as a coach or as a teammate because you know what this guy is capable of. We all, as fans, have seen it. You know, those games against Milwaukee, those finals runs that he's led us to. But when he's out there just standing around, like, is he going to break out of it in a few moments, in a few possessions? And should we be patient to see if he's going to do that? Because he's still capable. He just had a game against Detroit a few weeks ago that was one of his best game scores of his career.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, he also has games where you're like, will the real Jimmy Butler please stand up? Like, come to the court, please? Because it is not really Jimmy Butler out there. And so that's the frustrating thing, I think, for the Miami Heat, that we know that he's still capable. He may not be capable of what he was a few years ago, but he's very capable, a very good player. But at the same time, like, you just have to have a standard. And the Miami Heat have that culture slogan. The standard is not being upheld by him, whether or not, you know, it's a finals run. It's just giving effort. And I think it's hard to police the other players. If he's the leader of the team, whether he's the captain or not, he's one of the leaders and he's not giving full effort. And I just don't respect what's going on with that part of it.
Yeah. No, I 100% agree, Sean. In years past, like you said, he's had things off the court he's had to deal with. That's totally fair. And I understand that brings a certain distraction to what he's trying to do on the court. And that's very valid. But this season specifically, I also think that Pat made a good move of challenging him. And you would think that a guy like Jimmy Butler that likes to be challenged, or so it seems, and historically has stepped up to, whether it's other players or the coaching staff or somebody, just getting in his feelings a little bit, making him feel uncomfortable. He has that kind of mentality that you would think like, hey, he's going to take that and say like, oh, okay, you think I can't do this? Let me prove you wrong. Let me go out there and be the guy I've been in the past in those playoff series and just been playoff Jimmy or whatever the case is. And we haven't seen that except for a few times this season. That Detroit game is a prime example. And I'm low-key a little bit salty that he picked that time to do that, because I was playing against an opponent in fantasy basketball at the time. And he had Jimmy Butler, and he just dropped 80 points on my head. So I was like, you know, thanks, Jimmy, for pulling that out right when, you know, it hurt me the most. But 35 points, 19 boards, 10 assists, 4 steals, and a block. I mean, that is like the pinnacle of a Jimmy Butler performance. And he has played 3 games since then. And it's just really disappointing to see him go through all of this season with the drama and just saying like, you know, I don't think I'm going to get my joy back until I'm not on this team anymore. Just very disappointing to hear that from him. And I know he's probably not getting exactly what he wants from the team in terms of offering that max contract for whatever it is, 2 or 3 more years, probably what he's looking for. But the fact of the matter is, if you're not going to be on the court producing every single game, you're not going to bring the effort, the focus, the dedication. You're making it harder for the team to be comfortable giving you that kind of a contract. So he's kind of working against himself in a way, at least based on what we've seen so far. That's all very disappointing. But to put a little bit more of a positive spin on things here for a second, there are some guys that have stepped up in the wake of his suspension. So as we know, he's been suspended for 7 games. He's served 4 already. He has 3 more left. In those 4 games, I've been very impressed by what Jaime Jaquez Jr. has brought to the table. He's played a lot more minutes since Jimmy went out. And it's crazy because that game before Jimmy went out, he was scoreless. He had 0 points. And he had single digits in 9 of the previous 12 games. Now he's played 28 or more minutes in every game since Jimmy was suspended. And in the last 4, he's averaged 16, 6, and 5. He's had some monster games in that period of time. His shooting splits are good. He's only shooting 28% from 3 on the season, which has been a pretty big point of struggle for him. But in the past 4 games, he's at 36%. So I've been really impressed by what he's brought to the table. It's kind of like that rookie Jaime has come back again, and he takes over in certain points scoring-wise. But his biggest appeal is just doing a little bit of everything. I think that's very impressive. So kind of shifting over to that part now, do you also feel like that Jimmy's absence has also brought a little bit of a silver lining to this team in terms of opening up minutes for other players like Jaquez Jr.?
Yeah, and I think that's the way that the coaching staff probably is framing this. It's an opportunity for quite a few players, and Jaime is one that certainly has stepped in. And if you think about it, over the last year, he's had the opportunity to step in for Jenny many times because of when those absences happened. Oftentimes, he was the guy that stepped into the starting lineup, and I
Mhm.
think the fit with them together when they're both playing has been clunky because they occupy a lot of the same spots on the floor. You
Mhm.
know, Jimmy and Jaime both like to play a lot of that bully ball style. We know Jaime's not a great shooter. Jaime likes to be physical. He likes to get to the basket. He has great footwork. He finishes fairly well. That's the type of stuff that Jimmy wants to get into too, you know, in that mid range and attack. So it's been difficult with Jaime, but since Jimmy's been out, not that he can replace Jimmy Butler. That's not what we're saying, but like he is a high potential guy in his second year. We know he was an older rookie because he was a 4-year guy at UCLA, but I really am encouraged by the way that he's played. He does need to start making outside shots. That's going to be a ceiling for him. If he can't develop that outside jump shot over the course of his career, I think it's going to be difficult for him to get to whether it's a consistent starter, all-star status, things like that. Those types of things, he has to be able to make outside shots. The other guys, you know, just not to spend too much time on anyone. Niko Jovic, obviously, he's not starting now, but he's coming off the bench, playing really starters minutes. Those two seem to be sort of the engine right now of what the Heat are doing. Obviously, Tyler is the scoring piece, but those guys are doing a lot of initiation. They're running a lot of their sets through them, and both Jaime and Nico are very capable of distributing, moving, finding advantages. So I'm excited about that, and I really hope that if Jimmy is going to continue to be out, continue to lean into both of them, especially Nico, because he's so talented. He's still so
Mhm.
young, and so every minute that you're giving him is just going to continue to pay off in the long run. Other guys, obviously, Kel'el Ware has been starting to get some more minutes. I am not one at any point in time wanting to see him and Bam Adebayo occupy the floor at the same time. I am not someone that does the Bam to the four, all that stuff. Like, that's not me. But, like, he has shown flashes, but we have to understand, just like with Nico and really just like Jaime, they're young guys. Kel'el
Yep.
Ware is going to make mistakes. He's going to go out there and play 18 minutes and get like 2 rebounds sometimes because he's just a young kid. He's 20 years old. So if,
Right.
you know, you're trying to compete for a championship, this is not the group for you. But if we're thinking, all right, we can kind of tread water, see what happens with Jimmy, maybe bring somebody else in, I'm living with what these guys are doing right now.
Yeah, and to your point about that, it really comes down to, I guess, the focus and the way this team is constructed. It doesn't really strike me as a contending team, at least at this point. I mean, you look at their efficiency marks over the season. They're very mediocre offensively. They're a little bit above average defensively. Their net rating is 13th. So not really. The stats don't reflect a contender, and I don't think
No.
the eye test does either. Especially when they go into Miami and they played Utah a few games ago and get absolutely obliterated by 36 points. I don't see I don't see
No.
contender with results like that. So yeah, I mean the way they are right now, it just kind of seems like this team is built to be a pesky first round out. That's kind of what it looks like, as we've seen the past couple of years, honestly. And I'm also encouraged by what Nico's brought to the table and Ware. I'm just glad Ware's getting a chance here to kind of just get out there, make mistakes. When Thomas Bryant was in the rotation, it was like, okay, we're going with the vets. We're going with him and Love. They get most of the minutes here, and Kaleo just kind of has to get what he can in the G League, which, you know, at certain points that's fine. But now he's playing about 16 minutes per game, at least in the last 3 games here, 4 games. The previous 3 games, he was a DNP, so he's definitely getting some opportunities to go out there and make an impact. I just like having a bigger body out there. I know you're not one to be on the Bam at the 4, but when Bam is at the 5 and he's playing next to, you know, Jaime and maybe like Rozier and guys like that, I mean, it's really tough, especially against those bigger teams, to, you know, just really withstand the physicality and the rebounding punch they bring to the table. So with Kalel out there to just provide a little bit more size, a little bit more rim protection, that definitely helps a little bit. And yeah, with Nico as well, I think we get ahead of ourselves when it comes to younger players like Nico, because like you said, he's 21. And you look at the Heat community, and a lot of times you'll see guys say like, "Man, I think I'm out on Nico. I think he's I don't think he's the guy for us and things like that. But it's like third season, he's younger than Jaime was last season when he was drafted. So when you think about it like that, it's like maybe we should give this guy a little more of a pass and let him kind of work through some things. But yeah, all in all, I like how the team is competing here so far. They're 2-2 since the Jimmy suspension. Tonight they play Portland, another great opportunity to get a win. But I mean, 19-17, seventh in the East, things could be worse. So all in all, I don't think it's such a bad outcome here with Jimmy not on the floor.
No, and to your point about them being, somewhere in the middle of net rating, they are an average team. Every metric you want to look at essentially will point you in that direction. They are an average team. And I'll be quite honest. You throw Jimmy into the mix, they're better. No, we can't paint a picture because we're upset about the Jimmy situation that the Heat are better without him. They're not. But with him, are they a contender? I realistically don't think so. Like I'll go down with my guys throwing punches, but let's be realistic. Are they beating Boston, Cleveland in a 7-game series? Are they beating New York in a 7-game series? So now you're somewhere at least fourth or lower. And now we're not even talking about the West. So that's where, like, I don't think they're directionless like some, but I think that there is going to be some movement. This trade is going to probably kickstart that when that trade happens, because I'm not necessarily sure it's going to happen soon. It could get dragged out into the summer for all we know. And that's the entertaining, and I guess that's the best way to put it. The entertaining part of this is that every day there seems to be some new twists going on. But really the pivot, and I know you guys really get into the cap stuff, is the summer of 2026 and making those contracts that they get back align to a time where they're going to have a lot of expiring contracts, even if nothing happens. Let's say Jimmy comes back and he finishes his contract. He opts into that last year. You got Terry, you got Duncan, you got Jimmy. You have a lot of guys where money is going to start coming off the table, and now you can start to pivot a little bit. But to your point right now, a very, very average team.
Absolutely. Painfully average. Just looking at everything that the way the team plays and the stats and everything. But yeah, perfect point to look over at the, I guess, behind the scenes aspect of this team now. Looking at some of looking at the money situation, the draft pick situation with this team, and this is why their situation is it's not hopeless by any means, but it is tricky to kind of navigate these waters. I mean, let's look at Jimmy's contract first and foremost. $48.7 million this season, player option for 52.4 next season. So that by itself introduces a lot of complexities to just making a trade even work. It's going to involve a team sending back another player like a Bradley Beal that makes a lot of money, or just combining a bunch of salaries together just to get up to an amount that gets close to that 48 million. So, I mean, that's obviously the first obstacle. The second is that player option for next season. If Jimmy has the option to opt out and say, like, hey, I don't want to be here, I want to be a free agent, it gives teams a certain amount of pause because they need some kind of assurance that he's going to opt in and stick with them and not just bolt in free agency. So you add that on top of it, it's like, okay, I'm not sure if he's even committed to our team. If he doesn't like what we have going on, if we don't get confirmation from him, we're not going to do the deal, like, at all. Even if we have the assets to make it happen, it's not worth the risk. So that's another point of contention here, just making this really tricky just to get Jimmy to another team. And another layer of this is the fact that Jimmy has already crossed 2 teams off his list. You look at Memphis and Milwaukee, and it's like, oh, okay, maybe we can make this work. But he goes out there and looks at Memphis and says, I don't think I'm going to opt in with them. I don't think I'm going to stick with them. I'm not really a fan of that team. And now he's making it even tougher for himself to, being in a position with another team this season or next season. So all those things add up to just make for a really kind of just rocky waters here when it comes to the money situation and what he wants and teams that even want him. A team has to at least be in contention after the trade to even make it happen, or else it just doesn't make any sense. They have to be a Houston, a Golden State, a Phoenix. It's not going to be a Charlotte or a Toronto or a Utah. He's just too old. It makes too much money for that to make sense. So all that combines to make a very tricky situation. But I think moving on from him, I don't think it's the worst thing in the world, just because, like you mentioned earlier, a lot more flexibility under the cap. And then also getting some picks back would help a lot. Part of the reason the Heat haven't been able to make many trades recently is because, especially after the Rozier trade, not many firsts are even eligible to be traded. We owe a first to OKC either this season or next season. We owe a first to Charlotte either in 27 or 28 because of the Rozier trade. And there's only 2 seconds available at all in 26 and 31. So being able to get some picks back and kind of replenish that to also gain flexibility would be very beneficial for the Heat making this Jimmy trade. So those are just kind of some of the overall kind of obstacles standing in the way of this. But yeah, I mean, something's going to have to give. Jimmy's going to have to be less picky, or the Heat are going to have to ride out with him this season. Something's got to happen just to kind of make this all work, just because of all the different factors I mentioned there.
Yeah, and that's why this is not a simple thing. I mean, I think a lot of people look at it from afar and like, why haven't they traded Jimmy yet? Jimmy wants out. Do him right. And I agree with that. Like, he deserves the respect. And I don't think either side, the Miami Heat nor Jimmy Butler, want it to end like this. They want to be celebrating the past 5 years or 6 years because it was a great time, right? It was a great acquisition, and Jimmy was amazing here. But like you said, if we're looking around the league, there's somewhere between 0 and 29 teams interested in Jimmy Butler. And that number is closer to 0, not because Jimmy can't play, just because the scenarios don't fit. Thinking about fits, Phoenix is one, but Miami's not going to take Bradley Beal. Every indication, every reporting that's come out of 5 Reasons from Ethan Skolnick, who I trust, they're not taking it. So now your point again is you got to find someone that wants Bradley Beal. And why would a team at the bottom of the standings want Bradley Beal in his no trade clause? And appropriate for your podcast name, why would Bradley Beal waive his no trade clause to go to one of those teams? So it's like all of these things have to work simultaneously, especially if it's going to be the Phoenix direction, that all indications are Jimmy wants to be there. They have an extension on the table per Kendrick Perkins. Other options, it doesn't seem like there are a lot of options. It doesn't seem like a lot of teams, unless Golden State's suddenly going to change their mind, it doesn't seem like they're looking to go to Jimmy. If I'm Houston, I don't think I give up my young guys. I want to be like OKC, where I just have the treasure chest and I can do that later. I don't think they're ready for that. And the Milwaukee's, and there are a lot of situations where unless you're so desperate, he's caused such a stink that you're ready to get him out of here. I just think you just continue to try to be as patient as possible. You're always exploring opportunities, but if it comes, then there's other options too, with Terry Rozier, with Duncan. How much of a pivot? Even Tyler Hero, like you could argue for the fact of a complete reset around Bam and some of these young guys. So it's an interesting time to be a Miami Heat fan. I wish none of this was happening and we were just winning basketball games. But if you like the transaction talk, it's definitely an interesting time.
That's true. It's a very good point. There's definitely a different focus on Miami now. I think before it was just like contender or not contender. It was very simple.
Mm-hmm.
These days, it's like, okay, there's a lot more, I guess, sub-stories going on here in Miami, which is interesting. Not always fun, especially when those bad losses hit. But it is interesting to kind of dive into that. And speaking of Bradley Beal, I mean, he's in a interesting situation of his own in Phoenix. So Miami is trying to get off of Jimmy. That's not really working out. And then you have Bradley Beal here, who has not said he wants to leave Phoenix. He hasn't put anything like that out there. He is a little bit frustrated because the team has moved him from the starting lineup to the bench in the last 3 games. And that's not a position he's used to being in, at least not since he's been a veteran in the league. So in those 3 games that he's come off the bench, he has been pretty productive. He scored 25 points in 2 of those 3 games. The first game against the Sixers, and then the most recent game against the Hawks, he had 25 points. Obviously, he can be comfortable here and he can perform here. And personally, I think this is the best position for him, at least in the current iteration, the current construction of the Suns. Just because, Bradley is a guy that, he could play a little bit off ball, but at the end of the day, he needs to have the ball in his hands a good bit to be the most comfortable. So if he's assigned to be the leader of the second unit, it just makes him even more of a threat. He can go out there, have the ball in his hands, make plays with the ball in his hands, whether it's scoring or creating for teammates. and not have to worry about stepping on the toes of KD or Booker or whoever else is out there. So, you can deploy him with guys like Dunn. You can have him out there with Dunn. You can have him out there with Tyus Jones, Plumlee, and it just makes more sense. There's more lineup balance. Matt Issa is a guy I like to read a lot. He does a lot of great written work for a lot of different outlets. And he talked about in recent articles about just lineup balance in general. Like if you're going to be a great team, you need to have guys that can shoot, that can handle the ball, create, rebound, defend. And with the Suns, they were a lot more slanted to creation and scoring, and were lacking in defense rebounding. So that's why they put Dunn and Plumlee in the starting lineup to create more balance. So, strictly from an encore perspective, I think they're in better shape now than they were maybe a week or two ago, just because their lineup is more balanced now, and players are in positions to where they feel more comfortable or the most comfortable based on what they've done in the past and how their games operate. So it is unfortunate for Nurkic. He got a DNP last game. And before that, he was playing 14, 15 minutes a game, which is not usual for him. But between Iguodala coming off the bench there and providing a lot of energy, and then Plumlee, just another just gritty guy that can go out there and get rebounds and everything, makes more sense for the Suns. So it's a weird time in Phoenix, but I think overall they're in a better place. Are they going to make the playoffs? Or are they going to get back to where we thought they would be? Not sure yet, but things are at least trending up a little bit here in the short term, amidst all the drama with Beal and everything else that's going on.
Yeah, and I was someone that was pretty high on Phoenix going into the season, thinking that the coaching changes and some of the roster changes, because I think they really did a good job of bringing in role players like a Tyus Jones that they're really connectors. They're guys that fit. And to your point about the lineup balance, I don't think a lot of people ever really thought Bradley Beal and Devin Booker and Kevin Durant on the floor at the same time really made a lot of sense. And it's one of those things where it's not a video game. Like I'm too old to be playing video games anymore, but like it's just logical, man. Like I coach high school basketball, and today we were just spending time looking at lineup data, which is crazy that high school basketball, varsity basketball is now doing stuff like that. We're on Huddle looking at certain lineups, defensive rebounding percentages and assist percentages and different combos. And you have to think about how these pieces fit, because it's not video game. It's people and skill sets. And whether it's my high school team or whether it's the NBA, like a guy like Ryan Dunn that can go out there and just be a connector, just be a great defender, make sure that the ball moves and gets to the right spots. We saw that with Miami with PJ Tucker. Like, think about the impact that guy had. Kyle Lowry, as much as people like to disrespect him, he did that. He didn't do it at a star level, but he was a very strong role player and connector for that team. And those guys led us to probably the best team of that build, because they were great connectors. It wasn't necessarily about putting the best 5 guys on the floor. It was about how did the pieces fit together. And, right now I think Phoenix is trying to figure that out. There's probably moves to be made, but like at the same time, they don't have a lot of assets because of the way that they constructed this roster through acquisitions. And if you're looking at it, we talked about the Bradley Beal contract, 3 more years at 50 per, potentially at the player option in his last year at $57 million. It's a tough one to swallow, especially when he has the no trade clause. Nurkic, as you mentioned, basically not in the rotation at this point, making 18 and then 19 million the next season. It's just like, how do you get these guys out, especially when you don't have the sweeteners to attach? You don't have a first to throw on Nurkic's deal and say, hey, go take this. Kind of like Miami with Terry Rozier in a lot of ways. Like, there's a lot of parallels between them. And I think that's why you see them connected to Jimmy, because it's almost like, well, we already have this cap hold for Bradley Beal. We could slot Jimmy into that spot, and we've already invested so much in Book and KD. Let's see if we can make this work. So there's a lot of connections between these two teams. I don't know if either of them are contenders. I would say probably Phoenix is closer, but I just don't think realistically either of them are anywhere close to the top 5.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, Sean. And yeah, it's probably even more disappointing to look at Phoenix's situation when you do say something like, hey, I think they're contenders. They have a worse record than Miami right now. And, we've just talked about everything that Miami is dealing with here with Jimmy not playing and all that stuff. And here Phoenix lies today. They're 17 and 19 on the season, and they're out of the play-in situation here in the West. Part of that is because the West is very competitive, even when you get down to 8, 9, 10. But yeah, overall, I think Phoenix is still trying to figure out best lineups, how to deal with Beal and all these guys just all being on the roster. Just kind of what fits the best, what makes them the best version of themselves. But overall, you look at that team and it's like, man, like I know for me being a Miami Heat fan, it's like we're not in a great place right now. But I think overall, at least looking in the next year to 2 to 3 years, better place than Phoenix is. Very low on young talent, pretty much bare in terms of draft picks, except for 3 picks they have just because the rules state that you can't lose all your first rounders. Essentially, with their when it comes to their draft capital situation, they don't have their own first. It's essentially there's 3 teams in those years that have draft picks, and the Suns will get the worst of those 3 teams in those 3 drafts. So just to kind of paint a picture as to how bleak it is, it's pretty bad for them right now. They do have their first in 31, but yeah, I mean that's quite a ways out, and if you trade that one, I mean you are completely out for the next 8 years of draft picks. And in second rounders, they don't even have a second, possibly until 28, because it is protected to Boston. So that's not even a guarantee. And then their own second, like the first, doesn't even appear until 2031. So, I mean, all intents and purposes, I mean, they're out of first. Like you said, they can't trade any of those firsts they do have. So, very bleak in terms of draft capital. And then the contracts. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen anything like this in terms of just being so top heavy in terms of salaries. I mean, you look at their top 3 players, Katie's at 51, Beal's at 50, Book's at 49. You add those up, you get an average of 50 million per player. So you're looking at $150 million committed to 3 players on your roster, and it just goes up next year. And for context, I mean, the salary cap for next season is projected to be about 154 million. So you're almost at the salary cap of 3 players, which is blowing my mind. That's very difficult to navigate. And then, I mean, I was going to go there with Nurkic. I mean, you explained it perfectly. He's at 18 and 19. This guy isn't playing hardly, and he's your 4th highest earner on the team. Again, I mean, we talked about lineup balance, but I think there's also something to be said about salary balance with a team. There's 0 on this team when it comes to salary balance. You have 4 guys making 118 or 168, 169 million. And then you probably have another 50 million for the rest of the roster. I mean, that's insane. And coupled with the Beal no trade clause, it's really insane. I mean, I can't believe that the Suns made this deal with the NTC a part of this. I mean, if they made it and had him waive that, it looks a little bit better. But I mean, that's such a huge obstacle that it's just like, man, like where do you go from here? Because not only do you have to find a team willing to take him, you have to find a team that Beal himself is willing to be traded to. So it's just double the obstacles with everything. But I mean, if the Suns don't at least make a jump up to the 5th, 6th seed in the West and get to the second round conference finals, I mean, this is an L of a season. And with that, with the roster and the salary and everything else, I mean, that's not where you want to be. So I guess moral of the story, don't trade for a player that has an NTC. I guess that's the lesson to be learned here. It's an insane obstacle to try to overcome.
Yeah, and in comparing the 2 situations, as you mentioned about Phoenix having a very top heavy, 3 guys that essentially make 50 million. Miami is not as heavy at the top, right? Jimmy is their top earner at 48. Miami's problem being somewhat heavier than most teams, the gap between Duncan Robinson, who is their 5th highest paid player at 19 million, it goes all the way down to Haywood Highsmith at 5.2. And that lacking of those middle salaries that you can aggregate together and build trades, not even because they don't have the assets to attach, but also they just don't have like the puzzle pieces that make the numbers work. And that's something I think as we move forward, whether it's a Jimmy trade, whether it's a Terry trade, any of these types of things, you try to break those pieces apart so that you are able to move things around. But ultimately, this, like you have to pay premium money to have premium guys. So you're always going to have those $50-ish million guys on your roster if you're a good team. But yeah, for the Phoenix situation, I mean, it is grim. You almost have to ride out this season, hope for the best, and then now you have an expiring Nurkic, something that maybe you can try to trade for value. But like the Beal thing is always going to be hanging over until the end of his contract. It's very difficult situations for both front offices, even though you have some good pieces.
For sure. I mean, you talked about those middle tier contracts, and you mentioned that there's nothing for Miami between 19 and 5. At least the Suns have that going for them. We'll give them that.
Yeah.
They have Allen at 15.6. They have Royce at 9.3. They have Okogie at 8.2. So with them and Nurkic, I mean, they have 4 players that are making less than Duncan Robinson is and more than Haywood Highsmith is making. So they do have that, but the problem is a lot of those guys in that middle range, I mean, obviously excluding Nurkic, he's not playing well right now at all. A lot of those players are kind of key to what Phoenix does when their best 3 players are not on the floor. So I don't even think they want to trade those guys. I mean, Grayson Allen is one of the best floor spacers in the league. Royce O'Neal is just one of those like really solid connector guys, 3-and-D players that every team needs. Josh Okogie is a great energy guy. He brings a lot of grit, toughness, great rebounder for his position, loves to run the floor. So with those guys, I mean, yeah, they make pretty good money that you can aggregate, but I mean, at this point, you wouldn't really want to trade them just because they're so valuable. And then something else we haven't discussed yet, Sean, is the second apron situation that the Suns are in.
Yeah.
And that creates an even broader set of obstacles for any team to navigate. I mean, your tax at the end of the season is multiplied by a certain amount based on how far over you are. You can't aggregate when you're over the second apron. So, I mean, even if they wanted to pair guys together, they can't do that. Eventually, your draft pick 7 years out is frozen. So you can't be traded at all. And after a certain amount of time, it's dropped to the last pick of the round. So their first round will turn into a 30th, regardless of how they finish in the standings. A lot of obstacles like that. There's even more I haven't listed yet. But, I mean, overall, even if they did want to get better and try to trade guys, there's not a lot they can do unless they were willing to just take one of those big 3 contracts and ship them off and get smaller contracts to fill the void. So while they are here, while they're going for this championship with their big 3, they can't really pivot. But like you said, they have to stick it out this season, see how it goes, reevaluate in the summertime. And I mean, we all knew this was a short-term experiment. With KD being as old as he is and Beal being in his 30s and being a little bit injury-prone, we all knew that this couldn't last a long time. And also because of the salaries. Every owner has a breaking point, and I'm sure even with the Suns organization, they're hitting a point where it's like, man, I don't even know if it's worth it to pay all this money. So this really could be the last run for them. So hopefully they can get it together and, maybe encourage management to make one last run next year. But man, the way it is right now, we'll just have to see. It really comes down to Beal. But I guess the question for you, Sean, I mean, is there even a scenario that you envision in your mind for Beal to get traded like anywhere? It's hard to think of one, honestly.
Yeah, I was listening to a Ringer podcast this morning. They floated the idea of Detroit, which, again, I don't necessarily know why Beal would want to go there, but like Detroit is an up-and-coming team. Can they sell him on being kind of the co-star of a young group next to Cade, next to those other young guys, being a great vet, teaching them the ways? It's a team that you can argue can maybe push itself into the bottom end of the playoffs, and maybe you're building forward if they're willing to accept the fact that, look, if you're willing to come here, we'll pay that contract. Maybe you say, all right, let's look at that last year, that 57 millions. If you opt out of that, but we'll give you, instead of 57 for that year, we'll give you 2 more on top of it at 30 something per. Now you're making somewhere around 30 million total more over the course of that time as he's getting older. Like, can you sell him on something like that? I mean, if you're Detroit, it's the same pieces you've been hearing about with Miami and potential Jimmy trades, which I don't see why they would trade Jimmy there, why they would do this either. But like Tim Hardaway Jr., who else is there?
Malik Beasley,
Harris, Malik Beasley.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's guys that you're like not really thrilled with. I mean, it's not blowing you away, but it's like if I'm Phoenix, I mean, I've looked at it a lot more on the Miami side of things. I don't know if that's what I do. I just think I would try to figure out by moving my roster around if I can find a way, if I can start Ryan Dunn and maximize Beal as my sixth man rather than shipping him out and trying to make it work with Tim Hardaway Jr. and Malik Beasley. Like that doesn't seem like a championship recipe to me.
Yeah, that's very fair. Detroit is an interesting situation, but for the reasons you mentioned, again, it's very difficult. And like at the end of the day, it's like, hey, it doesn't even matter if a team can do the trade. Beal has the final say in every situation. So that's just the way it is. And I don't know if he'd go for that. So that automatically kind of strikes that idea down. But yeah, I think overall, just looking at these two teams, both going through growing or just overall just a lot of pain, I guess, in both organizations. Both, I would say, are underperforming this season. Both have a lot of questions about not just this season, but the upcoming seasons. And the rest of the season is going to be interesting to kind of see how this all plays out. With Phoenix, I mean, yeah, they're going to have to turn it around with who they have. And, maybe some guys can bounce back a little bit. Maybe Nurkic can bounce back a little bit. Tyus Jones, I don't think he's been that great the past several games. Maybe he can find a little bit of that spark again and just stay healthy. Above all, they need to do that to even have a chance. And then, for Miami, I tweeted this a few days ago, just kind of looking at the situation after thinking about it the past few days. I think it would be great if they can make some kind of a trade to get smaller contracts back, and then be a team like a Clippers team, to where you have a couple of guys that lead the charge. For them, it's Norman Powell, it's James Harden, and then a lot of just like less dominant pieces that just kind of like chip in and are just really tough guys that can defend and just do little things on the court like Derek Jones Jr. does and Chris Dunn. If they could get a team like that, I think in some ways they'd be better. You look at Spo's track record with teams that have like I called them spare parts in my tweet, but you look at teams he's had in the past where it's like guys that kind of fill one or two roles for a team that make a lot less money, that are a lot less featured, but he turns them into pretty decent players. I'm sure you remember Roddy Magruder back in those kind of like weird days of the Heat where Spo turned him into a pick and roll maestro out of nowhere. When Josh Richardson was at the height of his powers and 17-18 with D Wade, I mean, that was really cool to see. So, I mean, he can do a lot with a little. So if this team changes directions and goes to something like that, I mean, I honestly think they could be even slightly better in some ways than this current team. So I just want to throw that out there too, because it's something I've been thinking about, but only time will tell if Miami's even able to make a trade this season.
Yeah, and I said this recently. I want a mix. If a Jimmy trade is going to happen, whether it's now or this summer, I want a mix of picks and young assets, which we know it's not going to be premium type stuff, most likely.
Right.
That small type salaries, picks, so you start to recover the assets that we talked about that we don't have, and then a mix of guys that are 25 and 26 expirings. It doesn't necessarily have to be all 2025 expirings, assuming it happens before this deadline, because quite honestly, you're really not becoming a strong suitor for anything in 25 anyways. 26 is really when the reset can happen. And then that gives you the ammo this summer, turn July 1st, that I have already on my roster guys that I can trade that are 26 expirings. Now I have more. Maybe I find guys and let them run, through that contract in the summer 26. Now I'm a player when there's a summer that we know that some guys are going to get extended, but there are a lot of guys in that 26 summer that you can look at and be like, wow, that's an intriguing piece. I just think there has to be the soft reset. There's a lot of ways of explaining it. Miami's just not going to tank. And you talked about the pick situation with OKC. Yeah. The OKC pick that we owe, it is not advantageous to them, at least in my opinion, to try to tank this season, because you're ultimately you're going to keep that pick. And we know this draft is great, but now you got to owe more picks down the road. You're never getting back into where I actually own and control my own assets. And that's the direction that I don't think we're going to go.
Yep. Well said, Sean. I totally agree with you. And we're just going to have to wait and see how these two teams navigate this and if either guy gets traded. But as it stands right now, doesn't look like it. There's not a lot of scenarios in which these guys actually do get moved just because there's not a lot of options out there. And part of that is just because of the situations that the players have kind of created for themselves. So that's the gist of it. But that's about all I have, Sean. Unless you have anything else, I'm going to let you go. But thanks again for joining the pod here this afternoon. It's been a great time talking Heat, talking Suns. I feel a little bit better talking about the Suns, about the Heat situation. So I think that helped me for sure. But best of luck the rest of the season. Hope everything goes well. And thanks again for your time today.
Yeah, I appreciate you. Check us out, 5 on the Floor, 5 Reasons Sports, and support No Trade Clause. Do a great job. Appreciate you guys.
Appreciate you, man. Well, thanks again, guys, for joining this pod. You can catch us at notradeclause.com. If you want to check out our cap sheets, draft capital articles, we have all that waiting for you to check out. And then, of course, on social media, YouTube, and then our Twitter at @NoTrade_clause and Instagram, No Trade Clause, one word. We have even more content for you over there. So we'll catch you guys on the next podcast. Until then, enjoy these games, this NBA season, and we hope to see you soon.